Hi, everyone. I am so pleased to welcome today historian and scholar Dr. Lynn Price. Dr. Price was the assistant editor of the Washington Family Papers Project at the Washington Papers located at UVA. We are here today to help celebrate Martha Washington's birthday. And so welcome, Dr. Price. Thank you so much for being with us. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And as you mentioned, June 13th, 1731 is when Martha Washington was born. So sending out a happy birthday to her. And she was actually 8 months older than George Washington. So her little joke with him is she used to call him her old man.
Ah, cute.
So yeah.
That's funny. Well, it's great for you to be here, so thank you. Thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely.
I want to dive right in. So many interesting things to learn. So Martha Washington was married prior to meeting George Washington. What can you tell us about her early life?
Well, her early life is actually really interesting because there's some stories that go along with it that I think a lot of people don't know. She married Daniel Parke Custis in 1750, but what people don't know is the difficult nature of her becoming Mrs. Daniel Parke Custis. His father was John Parke Custis IV, and if people don't know who he was very well known as being a very cranky and argumentative individual. And he also had money. And so Daniel Parke Custis stood to inherit quite a bit of money from his father, therefore giving the cranky John Custis quite a bit of power in his son's life. And so prior to Martha, Daniel had been interested in two other women, and he had considered proposing marriage to them. And John Custis had said no. If you go ahead and marry them, I will disinherit you. And so now we get to Martha Dandridge, and Daniel says, okay, I'm interested in marrying her. She's about 20 years younger than me, but she is a Virginia lady, and he presents her to John Custis, and he has about the same reaction, which is, I will disinherit you. She's not good enough for my son. One wonders if anybody would have really been good enough for John Custis. And as the story goes, we're going to call her Martha Dandridge at this point. Martha Dandridge sets up a meeting with John Custis. And we don't know exactly what was said in this meeting, but right after it occurred, Daniel Parke Custis receives a letter from his father's lawyer. And the lawyer says, Martha Dandridge met with your father. Your father now says that he approves of her, that he doesn't know any other woman in Virginia who would be as good as Martha to be your wife. And then the lawyer says, quick, hurry up, get down here, because he may change his mind at any moment. And so they do. So we don't know what Martha said, and that's very curious, because what in the world did she say to this cranky individual to convince him that, yes, this is somebody worth my son marrying? And to give you an example, and this is one of my favorite stories I learned when working on Martha, the example I want to share is this cranky John Custis, to give you, to show you how cranky he was. On his tombstone, so he had some issues with his wife. They maybe didn't get along as good as they could have. And on his tombstone, it literally says, it has the amount of years he lived. So it says, years, and then it says, but lived but 7 years as a bachelor. So literally on his tombstone, he's saying that I only lived when I wasn't around my wife. And so that gives you an idea of this cranky guy who just, no one is good enough for him. He clearly has issues getting along with people, and yet something Martha said to him made him convinced that she was in fact good enough for his son. And so
Wow.
that to me sort of speaks volumes of Martha and what she was able to do and how she presented herself.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Certainly
and
exceptional.
yes, and sadly, he only lived until 1757, and so she was only married for 7 years. They had 4 children, and sadly, 2 of them died before her husband died. So she had Daniel Park Custis Jr., who passed away in 1754, and then Francis, who passed away in 1757, the same year as Daniel Park Custis passed away.
Oh, wow.
So by the time she meets George Washington, she has 2 biological children, but she has lost 2, and she's lost her first husband. And
Wow.
so she's in this state where her husband passed away. He did not have an executor, and so she had to do quite a bit of financial work to she basically had to pick up everything that he was working on. And so something that surprised and impressed me about her was immediately after he passed away, she was writing to people in London, and she was saying, you were dealing with my husband, he passed away, now you have to deal with me. And she definitely had a strong voice in her letters. And so you get this idea that that she was a strong woman, that she may have lost her husband and 2 of her children, but she was ready to take over and make sure that her money and, you know, her husband's money, and that the business continued as it had before. So I think that's something about Martha that surprised me at such a young age, that
Right.
she
And
was
how
already,
old was she when he died?
she was 26 years old
Okay.
when he passed away.
And how did she and George Washington meet?
Well, we know the first meeting was in 1758. So Daniel Parke Custis dies in 57, and they first meet in 58. The first meeting that we know of that's been written about was in New Kent County, in the home that Martha was living in. And you may have seen, there's some images where you'll see sort of a attractive looking George Washington in his, you know, in his military uniform, with a lovely young Martha and her 2 children playing, and, you know, they're chatting, and that's sort of believed to be their first real meeting. They probably had seen each other at some point before, but this is the one we know where they had the first meeting where they really engaged each other. And something that is interesting to me is, before I started studying Martha, I would always read things about how George chose her, and how George Washington, you know, picked Martha Washington. But the fact is that she's the one who actually had more money. And so she was the widow that quite a bit of men were going after. I mean, she was the one who was being sought after. And one individual who was her suitor was Charles Carter of Cleve, and he was about 25 years older than her, which isn't unheard of because Daniel Parke Custis was 20. And at that point, he had about 13 children. So it definitely would have thrown her into a very full family life. And we believe that family was very, very important to Martha. However, I think that she was looking for a good father for her children. And at this point, George Washington, he was well known for his time in the French and Indian War. So, you know, initially with Braddock's loss, he was being criticized for it. However, by the time he met Martha, he was seen as sort of a strong military, almost a hero of the French and Indian War. So she meets this young man. He has military service. He is seen as a hero, and, you know, he gets along with her children, and she sees him as a good father figure. And so really, I believe that she is the one who chose him, and that marriage was significantly beneficial to him, I mean, to both of them, but George Washington stood to gain quite a bit of money and status from marrying Martha.
Right, right, right. And you mentioned the French and Indian War, so switching gears a little bit and going forward, did she have any effects or any role in the Revolutionary War?
Oh, that's a great question. Originally, so when George Washington, he is given the role of commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and if you read his letters, the first thing he talks about is how worried he is about Martha, because he sees himself leaving for, they don't know how long this war is going to be. They don't really know what's going to happen. And honestly, at this point, they know they're committing treason because they're taking up arms against their government. And so he's really worried about Martha. He's going to be leaving her alone. He doesn't know how she's going to deal with that. So he writes to his brother, he writes to his son Jackie, and he says, please take care of her. Please make sure she's not too lonely. Please go visit her, have her visit you. So he's very concerned. And then he decides in 1775, it's October, and they're about to start their first winter encampment. So in the Revolutionary War, you didn't fight in the winter. You know, when the weather got bad, you would say, okay, we're on hold. Let's everybody just, we're just gonna hunker down. It's too cold to fight. And then you'd wait until spring and you'd start up again.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's October, they're deciding that they're going to go into winter encampment, and George Washington decides that he's the one who's lonely and he wants Martha to come and stay with him. And he writes to Tobias Lear, who is his secretary back at Mount Vernon. And he says, I really want her to visit me, but do you think that the British would try to capture her? Do you think that Lord Dunmore, who at the time is the royal governor, do you think, he wouldn't do anything, would he? He wouldn't try to kidnap her, would he? And Tobias Lear says, no, I think it's fine. She can come visit you. And he again writes and says, but are you sure? Are you sure this isn't something I should be concerned with? And the next letter from Tobias Lear just makes me laugh, because he says, Martha wasn't worried about it until you kept writing about it. And so I think he got that little nagging worry in her mind, because she hadn't even been thinking of being kidnapped. But thankfully, nothing happened. She did visit him this first year in Massachusetts in 1775, and she ends up at every single winter encampment. So there were 8 during the Revolutionary War,
right? And
she ends up at every single one with him.
Wow.
And you'll see that the officers talk about how he's in such a better mood whenever she's there. And you hear about soldiers saying she was sort of like a mother figure. This is something that's harder to prove. It's harder to find actual documentation, but we know that she was there and she was seen. She would meet with, foreign dignitaries when they would visit the camp. She would be there to meet with them. And so she was very much, when she was there, she was a comfort to George Washington, but she was also, she was known to the officers and apparently to the soldiers as well. So she was very much seen as a part of sort of the Revolutionary War and George Washington's encampments. And one of the things that surprised me in her letters was that she would write from the encampments to friends and family, and she knew what was going on militarily. So she would say, we know that the British have this many troops who are coming here, and we're expecting this to happen. And so to me, that spoke to what George Washington was sharing with her. And so I feel like she was very much someone he would bounce ideas off of, and that he shared information, which was just sort of surprising to me, because it seems like something that, she really wouldn't have had a role in.
Right.
And so it was really interesting to me that that he shared that with her.
And it sounds like maybe unknowingly she was sort of preparing for her next big role, which was First Lady.
Yes.
So what kind of responsibilities did she have as First Lady?
The thing about Martha Washington is I really think her goal in life was to have a big, happy family and to just enjoy her time at Mount Vernon. And while she may have chosen a good man to be a father figure, I think she sort of didn't hit the mark on what she was hoping for in life, because once the revolution was over, they go back to Mount Vernon, and I think she's ready to settle down, and she says, okay, now we can do what I've been hoping to do my whole life. And then he is elected to president of this new nation. And she's not necessarily thrilled about this. And of course, New York is the first capital of the United States. And so they live in 2 houses in New York. They live in one, and then they move into another one. And then the capital, of course, changes to Philadelphia. So when she's first in New York, she writes to some of her friends to tell them how she's feeling. And she writes to Mercy Otis Warren, and this is a famous quote that you will hear or you will read from Martha Washington, where she says, I'm determined to make the best out of a bad situation. Essentially, she says, it's not your circumstances, but it's your, it's how you deal with them that makes, that determines how you're going to come out of a situation. And then she writes to Fannie Bassett, who is her favorite niece, who she sort of sees as a daughter figure. And she says, I absolutely hate it here. I'm a prisoner. I can't do anything without everybody watching me or telling me what to do. And this is just absolutely horrible.
Oh.
So it gives you an idea of how she's talking to different people. And sort of when you see her writing to her niece or to her close family members, that's when you really get an insight on how she really feels about the situation. And it was tough because there were no precedents. And so they didn't know they didn't know really what the role was supposed to be. And so she was having to create this role, really. And one of the things that she did, and I can't say it was her own choice to do this, but she would have these little salons once a week where other women and men of higher classes would come and visit in the evening for a few hours, and they would have tea and cakes, and they would talk about politics or what's going on, for the day and things like that. And Abigail Adams attended them, and of course John Adams, and they talked about enjoying them, but how she was very prompt, and at 9 p.m. she would say, okay, we're done, and she was out of there. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that that's one of the first things that I'll say the Democratic Republicans and the Jeffersonians decided they were going to start attacking the Washington administration for, because they said that this was rather elitist and that they were acting like the salons in Paris. And the entire point was supposed to be of the revolution was that now it's about equality, and there's no monarchy. And they started to accuse George and Martha of acting like monarchists. And so that's a whole nother fascinating subject of sort of the press and the fighting between the two political parties during this time. And so I think what's important about that is that when you look at today and political parties fighting, that's absolutely nothing new.
Right.
It's and the press would personally attack George Washington, and they also attacked Martha's salons as well.
Oh, wow.
And so that was a really big part of what she was doing. And it was about getting out there and sort of promoting George Washington. And the thing about her is it wasn't really until Abigail Adams, the second first lady, she's the one who started really engaging with the press and the public. That's not really something that Martha did, but I feel like Martha created sort of a solid foundation for being someone who was not just sort of the wife of the president, but had her own roles as well. And I think the salons are a really good example of that.
Right. Well, interesting. Well, I do have one last question, although I feel like we could talk all afternoon, but tell me something that might surprise us to learn about Martha Washington and her life.
Well, I think one of the things that really surprised me was just how her life was absolutely full of loss. That she marries George Washington. Well, what happens before then? So at the end of her life, she lost all 4 of her biological children. She lost 2 husbands. She lost all of her siblings. She lost her favorite niece, her favorite nephew. Essentially everyone that she wrote to, that she had this intimate relationship, she lost. And so the last 2 years of her life, she moves up to the 3rd floor of Mount Vernon into this small room and essentially stays there for the rest of her life. And to me, it was just heartbreaking to see how everyone that she loved, who she was very close to, left before her. And that was something that struck me, that I didn't really know that about her. Another interesting thing about Martha Washington that I learned was about her relationship with her enslaved people. I think a lot of people know that George Washington freed his slaves in his will. And so when he passed away, he set in his will that once Martha Washington also died, that his slaves would be free. I don't know if a lot of people are aware that the enslaved population at Mount Vernon was not just George Washington's, but a lot of them were part of the Custis dowry. And what that means is that they didn't outrightly belong to Martha Washington. And so Martha Washington, even if she wanted to, could not have freed her enslaved population because they were meant for her children. They were meant to be passed down as part of a dowry. What was interesting to me is that George Washington seemed to change his mind about slavery throughout his life, which is why he did eventually, at the end of his life, decide that he wanted to free those enslaved that he owned. But it didn't seem like Martha Washington ever came to that realization. You don't see anything in her letters where she's morally questioning slavery or she seems to be struggling with it at all. And of course, there could be things going on that are not in written documentation or not in the letters that we have found. But from what I can see, she didn't have that transformation that George Washington had in regards to enslavement. And another thing that surprised me was that although George Washington put in his will that the enslaved population that he owned would be free after Martha Washington died, after he passed away, Martha Washington, I think some of the people at Mount Vernon began to worry a little bit, because if you think about it, all of these individuals are seeing that freedom is in their near future, but in what's standing between them and freedom is Martha Washington. And so she became concerned that perhaps well, they would benefit from her demise. And so they ended up being freed earlier than that. They were freed before Martha Washington passed away. And something that we know George Washington was concerned about was family units, because you have these enslaved people who belong to George Washington, these enslaved people who belong to the Custis dowry that are not outrightly owned by either one of them, and they have created family units. And so you have these husbands and wives and children in the enslaved population. And one thing that George Washington was so concerned about was not breaking these families up, not having one be sold, states away while the other one has to stay in Mount Vernon. And unfortunately, although we know Martha Washington was very much a family woman and cared greatly about her family, we really don't have any proof that she had any issues or concerns about that when it came to the enslaved population. Of course, there could have been something that we just don't have record of. So I don't want to say we're 100% certain, but it is something that's missing from the record. Whereas with George Washington, we know that throughout his lifetime, his mindset on the institution of slavery certainly did transform. Sort of a funny thing I didn't know about her was how, I like to use the word snarky, how snarky she could be. During the Revolutionary War, of course, she's very much a family woman. She would write home and she would say, how are things doing? How is Mount Vernon? And I guess her family members weren't great about writing her back. So she would start to write them letters that were essentially threatening them. One letter saying, I feel like everyone at home has forgotten me. And, will you write me back? And one of my favorites is she says, now it could be that, I'm writing to you and there's a letter from you that's in the post right now. So if that's the case, just, don't listen to what I'm saying. However, if it's not, you're not going to get anything else from me until I get a letter from you. Right. And so I liked sort of how headstrong she was. She definitely, when you read a lot of her letters, you think of these 18th century women as being very sort of, demure, and she was not afraid to say what she was thinking and what she wanted. And so to me, that made her more of a human being. instead of just, this character who was the wife of, the first president of the United States. And so that's
Right.
kind of a story I
Yeah.
like to
Well,
share.
amazing. Thank you so much, Lynn. It's been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon. What are you working on right now? Anything that you want to share or something coming up?
Well, right now I'm starting to research on an upcoming docu-series that will be on George Washington. So I can't say too much about it yet, but I'm excited that more information is coming out about George Washington. And I think people really like to watch shows about early American history and
Yep.
about George Washington. And so hopefully this one will also include um, some things about Martha as well. So people will get to learn even more about her.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Dr. Lynn Price. It was a pleasure having you this afternoon, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye, Lynn.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.